And look, if you will, at 1 Corinthians 13th chapter again. We've just read in verse 4 there in the middle of it, love does not envy. But notice the next one. Love does not parade itself and is not puffed up. This idea of parading itself. In other words, on this next slide you see in the bottom left-hand corner, you see the idea of a parade. Perhaps all of us have gone to a parade. And you know why you go to a parade? Because there are entries in a parade that the whole reason in the parade is for the town to see. They parade themselves down, and you get to see floats, you get to see bands, you get to see winners of whatever, and so it's pretty neat if it's in a parade, in that traditional setting. But do you see what Paul is saying here? He says the temptation of some is that they want their whole life to be a parade of themselves. Hey, look at me. Did you see what I did? Do you see what I have? Have you recognized my accomplishments yet? Do you see how this ties to envy? Envy says, I want what you have. Parading yourself around says, I want you to envy what I have. And Paul says, no, that's not love. Don't convince yourself you're better than others and then think now it's your mission to convince them that they know that you're better than them. It's an attitude that is ugly. And the reality is we try to justify it. How about that on the bottom right there? How many times have you heard something like that? It ain't bragging if you can do it. Last time I checked, that's the only time it's bragging. If you can't do it, it's lying. And so really the only time in a strict sense of it that it's bragging is when you can do it and you want other people to know, hey, did you see what I just did? Have you recognized me for the accomplishments that other people recognize me? Because it's real important that you envy me. It's real important that you notice me. And Paul says that's not love. That's not the life that we are striving and should be striving to live. There's a Wall Street Journal article, and I thought it was interesting. It's in Wall Street Journal. It's a couple years, in 2012 of August, so it's almost exactly 2 years ago. And Elizabeth Bernstein says, are we all braggarts now? And she begins with, I guess you'd say, a little bit of sarcasm in the opening lines of her article. And she says, friends, family, and co-workers, I think you're fabulous, just not quite as fabulous as you think you are. And then she says, for example, let me give you a few of your latest posts. Best gift ever from the best husband ever. Or, got my first royalty check for my book. Or, sunset sail turned to moonlight sail, shooting stars everywhere, perfect. And then she continues by saying, a benign reading would be that these are just typical daily updates. But folks, this is bragging, whether you recognize it or not, and it's out of control. How did this happen? It's interesting when you think about what is accepted as a double standard on social media that truly is immodest. And what I mean by immodest is inappropriate. I know it's very general to say, we very quickly accept bragging on social media. When if we or someone came up to our face and did the same thing, we would really think something's wrong with them. And my fear is we're not many years away from what is being done on social media being done in real life. And it's really going to be weird. It's really going to be odd. Can you imagine when it becomes the norm, the sermon's over, you come out, if you choose to pass by and shake my hand instead of maybe the occasional, hey, that was a great sermon today, I appreciate it, preacher. What about if instead the norm is the preacher says, hey, that was a great sermon, wasn't it? Do you like it? That's where we're getting to. That's where the norm is right now in social media. Let me tell you how great I am. Let me tell you how great my life is. Let me tell you how great my marriage is. Let me tell you how great my parenting is. Let me tell you how great my children are. And all of this is also in hopes that it's liked. I want you to give me confidence. I want you to like me. And then the shame is, even if it is or isn't liked, it's accepted. Nobody looks at it and says, that is really, really weird. To spend every day constantly telling people good things about yourself. And so this article develops that, and of course, for time's sake, we don't have time to develop everything in this article, but it just says that the challenge of this changing anytime soon is going to be very difficult because also it's changed parenting. And it says changes in parenting style also play a role. Nowadays, every moment, from the first day of school to exhausted nap in the back seat of the car, is documented. The problem is that these are shared moments, can easily come off crowing about, look what a great mom and dad we are, look about the fabulous and adorable kids that we have. And then it goes on and talks about in the brain that there's a part of the brain that responds. It's the idea, like Harvard University did a study on it, it's the idea of the reward section of the brain. And when there's food, that section of the brain is activated. Or when there's an intimate relationship, that section of the brain is activated. But also what's interesting in studies, that same section of the brain is activated when you talk about yourself. And so see, there is that feeling inside that says, I love to talk about myself. And if we're willing to do that, we will do it over and over and literally feel good about it. And if we're not careful, because remember, we've been talking this whole time, this love that God is calling us to practice, it's spiritual, it's not fleshly. And so when we do things by a fleshly nature, it's probably not going to be that spiritual that the Lord is calling us to. And so we can talk about ourselves and feel really good. Literally, our brain releases chemicals that we feel really good talking about ourselves. As a matter of fact, in the experiment, they even offered money to individuals, and they said, and in this experiment, they'd offer money if they talk about other people, and then they'd offer money if they talk about themselves, and then they started taking away the money as they talked about themselves. And people would choose to not get the funding or the rewarding of financial gain to still continue talking about themselves. So when we think about this, we see that our culture is probably not going to agree with this at all. But then we have to say, are we going to agree with it? Are we going to continually boast of ourselves? Let's skip the next slide. I read this as I was listening online to another sermon on 1 Corinthians 13, and the guy said about this particular fact of boasting, he said, empty trucks make the loudest noise. I like that. If you know anything about hauling stuff, that's so true. But here is what's really true. I want to just challenge you with this. Proverbs 27:2. Proverbs 27:2. Will you live this week with this in mind? Let another man praise you and not your own mouth or your fingers. A stranger and not your own lips. It doesn't matter if it's become the norm. If it's sin, it's sin. And if it's a lack of love, and I think sometimes that's what we're going to struggle to believe. We literally do not love others when we're constantly posting about ourselves. You can say, I don't believe it. You got to believe God or not. And so you have to decide. When you're constantly bragging about your family, you're constantly bragging about your kids, you're constantly bragging about your marriage, you're constantly bragging about your job, about your performance, God looks at that and says, a serious lack of love is taking place in your life. And I know the world would say, oh, but it's normal. If you don't get yourself out there, no one's going to know about you. And so now we've got this love of the flesh. We got this, remember 1 John 2nd chapter and verse 15, do not love the world, neither the things are in the world, lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. That's what we're battling right here. Are we willing to not be driven by the pride of life and to humbly fly under the radar, and when praise comes, it's only because others have decided to praise. And what a blessing that is if we can really figure it out. Notice the last one, and we're going to mention it just as we close. In 1 Corinthians 13:4 is not puffed up. It's very similar. It's the idea of lifting ourselves up higher. And when we do that, what we do is we fail to see others, we fail to see God, and we fail to see His righteousness. In 1 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, we see that he uses the word in a negative sense of the Corinthian brethren being puffed up. In 1 Corinthians 4:16, he talks about that, and also in 18 on the next slide. And then also in 1 Corinthians 5, he even talks about they couldn't see the sexual immorality that was among them because they were puffed up. In 1 Corinthians, the 8th chapter and verse 1, they were not minding, those who were supposedly more spiritual were not minding those who were weaker stumbling because of them, because they were puffed up. And so I just want to read a few of these, and you think about these as they relate to our pride and our arrogance from these last two sections that we've just read of love does not parade itself and love is not puffed up. Proverbs 8:13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. So are we going to hate evil? Here's what evil is. Pride and arrogance and the evil way, the perverse mouth I hate. So in other words, if we're bragging on ourselves, the Lord says that's a perverse mouth and God hates it. Proverbs 11:2, when pride comes, then comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom. Do we see braggadocious post and say, wow, that's shameful? That's a shame. That person ought not be involved in that. That is really going to hurt them in the long run. And even the Harvard study revealed how it hurts in the long run. People do not do well that go out bragging and get their self-esteem from others. Proverbs 13:10, by pride comes nothing but strife, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And now let's go back to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 3:3. For you are still carnal. For where there are envy, we studied that today. There's strife, and we've studied how that puffed upness leads to strife, and divisions, and that's a cause of it too. Among you, you are not carnal and behaving like mere men. So what I learned today, number one, I learned that envy will lead us to eye each other in a sinful way instead of keeping our eyes on Jesus and others in a loving way. Number two, I learned we have all been to a parade, but some try to live one. Don't. Never boast. Number three, I learned being puffed up will literally blind us spiritually. We will get to the point we can't see our own arrogance or sin. Number four, love is the choice to live without envy, without boasting, and without arrogance. What a wonderful way to live. How will you apply this lesson of love this week?